Deerin, and I'm the Director of Reform Scotland. Welcome to today's event, where we're going to discuss the I guess, troubled relationship between Holyrood and Westminster, the machinery behind that and whether it's fit for purpose. And I suppose what, in policy terms, we might expect from the independence debate on both sides of the border over the next few years. Joining us to do that are two very distinguished guests, mandarins of the highest order. They're both making quite the impact on the public debate now they've shaken off the muzzle of Whitehall and are free to say what they really think. First, let me introduce Ciaran Martin, who is currently Professor of Practice at my old stomping ground, the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Ciaran is a former Director of Constitution in the Cabinet Office, and he oversaw the arrangements for the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. After that, for 6 or so years, ending in the middle of 2020, Ciaran led the UK government's work on cybersecurity, which included establishing the National Cybersecurity Centre in 2016, which is now recognised as one of the leading global authorities on cybersecurity. I don't know whether he'll be able to tell us what caused today's internet outage, which seemed to cause a lot of drama on social media, at least. And Ciaran's also worked for the Treasury and the National Audit Office. Philip Rycroft is the former head of the UK Governance Group in the Cabinet Office, where for 4 years he had responsibility for advising ministers on all aspects of the Constitution and devolution. Philip's also an ex-permanent secretary of the Department for Exiting the European Union and was responsible for leading the department in all its work on the government's preparations for Brexit, which must have been one hell of a job, Philip. He was also the Director General in the office of Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister, and has worked in the civil service in Scotland and in the European Commission, so an incredibly broad CV. So the plan is that Philip, Ciaran and I will have a bit of a chat, then we'll open up to questions as usual, so please send them through using the message button on your Zoom screen, and we'll try to put the best ones to our guests. And if I could just remind everyone again to mute yourself unless you're one of the speakers, please. So Philip, let's start with you. I wonder if you might just give us an insight into how Whitehall views Scotland, both in terms of its importance or lack of importance in policy discussions and decisions in relation to the independence debates. You know, are we a massive pain in the backside, or is there a sense that we have a point? But just give us an indication of them looking north, what it is they see and how they feel about us.
That's a very, very big question, and it would take me a long time to answer it to its fullest extent, or maybe let me do it slightly by anecdote. So as you indicated, I cut my teeth in the devolved context. I worked 20 years in for various iterations of what is now the Scottish Government, and went south in 2009 on secondment initially to work what landed up being the business department. The Whitehall I walked into was one which bluntly did not pay a huge amount of attention to Scotland, or indeed to Wales, or with some particular exceptions, which Ciaran will be well placed to talk about, Northern Ireland. Why was that? Well, if you think about what had happened pre-devolution, you had the Scottish office, the Wales office, and the Northern Ireland office, essentially administratively looking after the affairs of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So it wasn't deep in the Whitehall tradition to be thinking much about Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And then with devolution, you've got the addition of the creation, obviously, of the legislatures in the three parts of the UK, and therefore legislation moves from Westminster out to the devolved parliaments and assemblies. Even less reason for Whitehall to be worrying about what was going on in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And that was really the context which I came into. And if you looked at it from a Whitehall perspective, when if you think about the way the incentives work in Whitehall, what you're trying to do is to deliver for your Secretary of State, for your department. The devolved stuff very often was a pain in the neck, because it meant more work, meant complication, and you didn't get any credit for it. So this whole thing about devolve and forget was a sort of evolved response. It wasn't people being mean or bad. It was just what worked in the Whitehall context. So Ciaran and I, when we were dealing with the Scottish referendum campaign, had a lot of work. We had our work cut out to get Whitehall to pay attention.
And Ciaran, maybe you could take it from there. Is there a sense that maybe since 2014 and how close the result was relatively, and I guess the fact that independence hasn't gone away as a subject of debate, is there a sense that the view in Whitehall has changed any? And I don't know whether you were able to talk also about not just the civil servants, but the politicians in Downing Street and number 11 and across the Westminster ministerial pool. You know, if it's a pain in the neck for the civil servants, I imagine that times 10 for the politicians.
Well, there's a lot there. Firstly, thanks for having me. Secondly, I don't know if you're trying to do a sort of phased return to normality, because the way we're doing this, I can see the names of the far too distinguished audience we've got. So I'm now just very nervous about all of this. And there are some people on this call who are in the audience who should be probably...
they're much less impressive in person.
Not me, but... So first of all, I mean, probably I'd make 3 points on that. One, just to go back pre-2014, I agree with what Philip said about the incentives in the civil service, but I think on reflection, you know, and this wasn't noticed at the time, and I didn't notice it even though I was sort of around bearing sort of very junior witness to what was going on. Even for those parts of Whitehall that got devolution because they had to, so the Treasury was a really good example. You know, the Treasury was obsessed with devolution because it wanted to make sure that it didn't do too much damage to the fiscal integrity of the UK. So the Treasury put a lot of effort into the devolution settlement in the late 90s, but it was the sheer technocracy of it. It was a technocratic exercise. You know, I think Michael Keating's on the call, and I've just been reading his you know, stupendous newish book on the fractured union and the whole sort of sense of the constitutional history and the importance of the devolution settlement as a constitutional adaptation. And there was no sense of that at all. It was right, okay, so we've made a political concession. I mean, Northern Ireland is different. I mean, the timing was coincidental and simultaneous, but it's a very different path to a devolution settlement that we all know. But Scotland and Wales was, well, we made a political concession. How do we, you know, in a bit, it's a bit like some of the Brexiteer criticisms of the civil service. You know, it's a problem to be managed rather than a redesign and to be seized. And that was certainly how it felt as a junior civil servant in the late 90s and early 2000s. So even for the parts that couldn't devolve and forget, it was just manage it as a technocratic exercise. This isn't, you know, it minimised the change to the UK as a country as a result of these constitutional changes. I think that's the background you're dealing with. Has it changed since 2014? In institutional terms, I think a little bit. I mean, I won't comment on the impact of Brexit because Philip's on the call. So, you know, in terms of the impact of that on the dealings with the constitution. But if you take then the job I did during that period, setting up the National Cybersecurity Centre, I mean, in a sense, it was really interesting because it was your classic mix of the absolutely reserved. I mean, you know, the Russian state intrusions and, you know, monitoring them. I mean, you know, nobody is going to say that's anything other than reserved UK matters, but actually, you know, the giving, how does this affect, you know, privately owned energy companies in Scotland? How does it impact on the newly devolved services that are paying out millions of pounds in government administered programmes in Edinburgh? You know, it was a classic mix, and there was more of an incentive on me, I felt, to get Scotland right, if you like, to show. And in fact, I think a lot of this, you know, the Glasgow airport bomb of 2007, just after the SNP took power, was a really important development in that, you know, where MI5, you know, quite clearly said, right, this is a devolved government, it may be led by a nationalist, but we are the National Security Authority of the United Kingdom. We are going to make it work with this new administration that nobody knows. And very much that ethos carried into my cybersecurity job. But having said all that, I do think a lot of the long-standing problems that Philip and Jack Shelton and Mike Kenny's excellent paper brought out were still there. The final point on politicians, I will just make one point that isn't made often enough, maybe because it's so obvious. Scottish MPs have disappeared from UK-wide politics. And the importance of that cannot be overstated. And you know, you can talk all you like about institutional design, but the fact is, for a union to work in the way that we're used to, the Anglo-Scottish Union, it tends to require large numbers of Scots in all the major political movements playing a leading role, and that isn't happening anymore at the instructions of Scotland's electors. And of course, that makes a change, because, you know, even if you go back to 2011, Labour may have been in opposition, but you had people like Alistair Darling, still active and playing a very important role. You go back to pre-2010, you had one of the most Scottish heavy cabinets in British history, and now the last and Philip knows this better than me because of the dynamics of the coalition, but the last Scottish MP to play a senior role in a British government or opposition is Danny Alexander, who lost the seat in 2015. So that is the fundamental change. So in a sense, how can Whitehall, Westminster politicians get Scotland in the way they used to when there aren't any Scottish MPs around at the top of the major British political parties?
It does seem like an incredible oversight, and I've written about that a lot actually, about the sudden absence of Scots from the front line of Westminster politics, especially because even if you go back to Thatcher and you had Malcolm Rifkind and George Younger and Ian Lang, significant people doing significant British jobs, and that had always been the way for decades and decades. And then suddenly they're all gone, and the front bench is just, it's not a matter of accents, but it's English accents, it's English constituencies, it's people with a prejudice towards, obviously, matters in England. And in Scotland, I think that added to the sense that Westminster suddenly felt very far away and not particularly relevant or well-minded towards Scotland. And it's funny how that wasn't really foreseen or anything was done to try and manage that as we went along. I suppose one of the other things that stems from what you're saying is the relationship between Holyrood and Westminster. And when it was being set up, Holyrood in the late 90s, you obviously had a Labour government at Westminster. You had what was going to be a Labour government at Holyrood, whether in coalition with the Lib Dems. And the sense when that was being set up was you had two governments that were largely working in concert and wouldn't fall out for the sake of politics or whatever. And I suppose the question is how well that's withstood the change to not just governments of different parties, but governments of probably the two most opposed parties in the United Kingdom, the SNP on one side, the Conservatives on the other, and whether the structure that was put in place to manage those intergovernmental discussions, fallouts, whatever, whether that still works now, or whether we should be returning a bit to the drawing board on that. Does it need rewired, and if so, how? What would either of you like to take that on?
Maybe make a start on that. I think the sort of the joint ministerial committee arrangements you're referring to for intergovernmental relations, obviously were put in place in '99, sort of various structures and so on, but more honoured in the breach than the observance. There just didn't seem to be a need to settle stuff through a formal machinery when you could do it by essentially folk from the same political party, the Labour Party, sorting this stuff behind the scenes. And the work that I did with Mike Kenny and Jack Sheldon sort of documents the history of the James. The others have looked deep into that space as well. So by the time you get to the 2007 minority SNP government, some concern that this machinery wouldn't be able to cope with the incongruence of political parties. Actually, and not least for the reason that Ciaran pointed out, that early start around the Glasgow attack and so on, the machinery did sort of function through that administration. I think largely because it was such a minority administration in Scotland and needed to focus on proving its competence. Things began to change clearly in 2011, and then you have the pressure of the referendum. The machinery sort of survived that, but only just. But what the twin shocks of Brexit and COVID, I think, have revealed that the structures we have to manage intergovernmental relations are simply inadequate. They cannot bear the weight that is put on them. And so something needs to change, something needs to give. I think just as a clue what that might be, you can think about structures, that's clearly important, but it's the spirit that informs those structures that is more important. And I think the key word in all of this, from my perspective, is the respect word, that you have intergovernmental relations that demonstrate unequivocally to people in Scotland, also Wales and Northern, actually also England, which has been the missing part of all of this, that those arrangements are such as to respect the interests of all parts of the UK. And that, frankly, has been missing from the equation over the last 4 or 5 years.
Ciaran, do you want to add anything to that?
Endorse what Philip has said. 2 quick points. One is, I think, the arrangements at the start were pretty sloppy and lacked some foresight. I mean, there are some quite amusing anecdotes about, for example, I think for quite a while, the Scottish Executive, as then was before rebranding, and the Scotland office were on the same IT system, which, had to be phased out over time. And we had various buildings that were shared and so forth, which had its moments of awkwardnesses at times when when it was a Labour First Minister visiting Labour cabinet ministers, it was no problem. When it was Conservative and Lib Dem coalition and an SNP First Minister on the brink of an independence referendum, that's quite another. So there was a bit of sloppiness around that. But actually, I think some of the formal ones weren't really. Actually, the more serious the issue, the better it worked, frankly, which is why Glasgow is quite a good example. And obviously, people will examine what's happened in COVID. I also think, though, to be fair, it's a hard problem. I mean, it's easy for it's easy for people like me to sort of moan about it, but it is a hard problem now, in that you look at the dynamics of the devolved politics in the UK. So something when I talk to Whitehall political figures and civil servants who genuinely want to try to make things work, they say, look, can people like you cut us some slack? We are not dealing with a potentially constructive partner in a pro-independence administration in Holyrood. And I think in some respects you can push back on that. In national security issues, they're perfectly constructive because they take it quite seriously. But ultimately it is different when you're dealing with, say, even a Welsh Labour unionist administration, so a different political party, but is not intent on the peaceful breakup of the country. It is different when you're dealing with an administration that is formally and actively separatist. They're not looking, it is not, and the SNP should not be criticised for this, but it's not an objective of the SNP to make the union work. So, I do think that makes, whilst some of the mistakes in the first decade, can and are and should be rectified further, I do think it is quite a difficult challenge to make it work in this political environment. Of course, and it's not just Scotland. You've got the added tensions with the sort of joint administration in Northern Ireland. I sometimes then think actually you can almost judge the good faith and intent and competence of the UK government actually not by Scotland but by Wales, because there you do have an administration where you've got plenty of people who are actually sort of despairing that we want to make devolution work, and if you can't make it work with us, you're never going to make it work anywhere. And so I think that will be assuming some form of stability, at least in the short to medium term in Scotland, quite interesting to watch how they deal with Wales. Because they're not dealing with an administration that's seeking independence.
And you both touched on the fact that it's not just Scotland. And really, there's a question for the whole of the UK, directly elected mayors in London and Manchester and Tees Valley, the West Midlands and more, with Wales and Northern Ireland devolution, House of Lords and calls for reform there. I'd be interested to know about whether there's appetite at Westminster, but more in Whitehall, for, on a scale, a rewriting of the British Constitution, whether it's regarded as necessary or desirable. It's always said the man in Whitehall wants to keep power as close to them as possible. Well, that doesn't really work in Britain today. But a lot of the structures that are in place are pre this, and actually, as more devolution happens throughout Britain, and I'm sure we will see more of it as time goes on, should we be looking at a more fundamental rethink of the way the United Kingdom's set up and how the centre relates to the periphery? Philip, I don't know if you want to.
Do you want me to kick off on that? It's a huge question. I think you step back from this debate now, and Scotland, essentially, the polls saying Scotland is basically split down the middle, a bit of volatility in the polls, but you've got 50%. One part of the UK is wishing to withhold their consent from the remaining part of the United Kingdom. And we're not going to have a referendum this year or next year, maybe not for 3-4 years, but how long can we sustain this essentially unstable equilibrium, this sort of standoff that we have at the moment? It's not a comfortable place to be. So I think there is a question as to whether there is an alternative between the two poles of status quo, pretty much as we are now, maybe a wee bit of rein back on the devolution settlements, as we've seen with things like the Internal Market Act, or independence, is the way of reconceiving the United Kingdom, which would would put it on a footing where people would say, a good majority of people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and indeed England would be saying, this is a union that can be sustained for some time to come. I think that's one of the biggest questions in British politics right now, but and of course it's beginning to get looked at from various angles, from the Starmer Commission, from the Labour perspective, and there's plenty of think tank and other activity around this. So the debate, I think, is beginning to bubble up. What I don't see, frankly, at the moment is much interest in that sort of major constitutional change from the UK government perspective. It doesn't surprise me at all when you've just come through the sort of the shock of Brexit and the premise of Brexit, which was ultimately about the reassertion of what in some respects is a quaint notion of parliamentary sovereignty, but nevertheless that is what has driven the Brexit wave. This is not the sort of administration who stop, hang on a minute, let's stop and think about how we hold and conceive of the holding of power within the nation, and let's start dispersing that in rather different ways. I mean, you mentioned things like the House of Lords. I mean, I'm a veteran of one attempt to reform the House of Lords. We got further, frankly, than any attempt for several decades. We got through second reading, but it did crash and burn then. But it's extraordinary that, in this country, in this day and age, we still have something like the House of Lords as part of our so-called democratic infrastructure. And of course, in order to rebalance the constitution, you would have to do something with the House of Lords. But I see absolutely no appetite from the current government to sort of get into that sort of space. So the risk is that the debate forces that polarization. It's either one thing or the other. It's either the status quo or it's independence, and there is no alternative. And my personal view, that for those who worry about the sustaining of the United Kingdom long term, that's a fairly powerless place to be.
Yeah. And we talk about, just stick with you for a second, Philip. We talk about Brexit and its impact on the union, and certainly for someone my age, it was the first, certainly the most cataclysmic event that really undermined the sense that the mechanism of the union worked for Scotland. Obviously, we voted substantially to remain in the EU and had to leave because of quite a small majority, relatively speaking, in England. The sense that whether you were a unionist or a separatist, or pro-independence, the sense that the Scottish voice wasn't taken into account, and obviously Britain was going to leave the EU on the basis of that vote, but the sense that you were at least being listened to or acknowledged, or the difference was being acknowledged. That sent a real shockwave through Scotland, I think, and maybe amongst those people who'd voted no in 2014 and Remain in 2016, and they call them the indie curious a lot of the time now. It did sort of in due course shove people maybe closer towards supporting independence. What was it like within Dexu when you were dealing with all of this? Because I'm guessing Scotland didn't rank very highly on your considerations.
Well, I was wearing two hats for the last 2 years of my career. So I was looking after Brexit, but I also carried on looking after the UK governance group. So if nobody else was worrying about it, I was. And it was actually a major part of the consideration, because I think the shock of Brexit to the integrity of the United Kingdom, this was not a surprise. There'd been lots of folk talking about this prior to the referendum, particularly around Northern Ireland, but also around Scotland and Wales. And lots of people thinking about the different scenarios. The one that came to pass was one where essentially it revealed, it stripped away the ambiguity that had rested over the devolution settlements, and things like the Sewell Convention, the notion that the UK Parliament would ask the permission of the Scottish Parliament, the devolved assemblies, if they sought to legislate in areas that impacted on devolved responsibilities. And you have the Miller case that confirming that this was not binding. Of course, we all knew that, and that was the legal position. There was no doubt about that. But then, this is revealed as a hard political reality. So, the Brexit equation has, the way that Brexit has happened has demonstrated just where power rests within this union. And there's an argument to say, those who look at the history of this over time, that the reason the Union has subsisted over many centuries in the case of Scotland is because of that almost self-denying ordinance on the part of the English not to assert their view over the other parts of the UK. Well, Brexit, from many people's perspective, is an assertion of an English view. And of course, that has had a huge impact on perceptions in Scotland. But in the sort of short term, in the job I had to do, trying to weave a way through this, not just because of that existential major issue, but because also of the day-to-day issue about the extent to which the devolved administrations would get a look in on the negotiating position of the UK government. And that was, I can say, unmuzzled, was bloody hard work. And we put a lot of effort into that. But I think ultimately the governments of not just Scotland, but Wales as well would say that they did not feel they made much of a dent in the UK government's negotiating position.
And it does feel like that's a hard thing to come back from. I think there's a sort of constitutional trauma that has accompanied that, I think, in Scottish terms. And Ciaran, you being unmuzzled have been particularly trenchant, I think, in some of your public statements on this thing. So you said that Brexit has been done to Scotland rather than involving Scotland, and that this has brought in what you've called know your place unionism, which is quite a sort of extreme characterization, but perhaps actually perfectly reasonable. What's your sense of the consequences for the independence debate of Brexit and the way it's been handled in relation to Scotland?
Well, I think to explain where those phrases came from, I mean, I defer entirely to Philip on how the last 5 years have played out, but I think to put it in historical context and to quote someone who isn't here, but when I worked on the paper that I published in April, I worked a bit with Sir Tom Devine, obviously I have foremost authority on the history of Scotland. And I think going further than just the sort of restraint of the larger partner that Philip talked about and I talked about previously, there was something in Tom's history of the Union which goes beyond the sort of classic Linda Colley, it was forged through Protestantism and empire, but actually very astute management of the Union. There was actually management of the Union in the 18th century, sort of the titan figures of the Duke of Argyll and Henry Dundas and all the sort of boards and so forth in the 19th century. In the 20th century, you've basically a coalition between Churchill and Tom Johnson during the war to keep Scotland on side, and then you have Churchill actually the Conservatives fascinatingly pushing back on the welfare state's encroachment on Scottish distinctiveness and the nationalised. It's really, really interesting the way this happens. So I remember asking Tom, we were working together, I said, Tom, in the whole 300 plus years of the history of the Union, is there any form of precedent, and I've asked this as neutral as I could, is there any form of precedent for a decision of such national importance being taken in complete contravention of the expressed wishes of the Scottish electoral majority, both in the referendum of 2016 and in the subsequent general elections? And we debated for a while whether the 1712 Patronage Act constituted such a precedent, and then he decided that it didn't. And given who he is, we'll go with him. So in terms of that trauma, I think it is as big as that. And and I can see there's some questions in the chat. Why is it true that there's no interest in constitutional reform? I do think one of the things about the British state that isn't specific to this Conservative pro-Brexit government, but just in the way that Tony Blair didn't do God, the British state doesn't do constitutional statecraft. I mean, the fact that at the minute there is no real understanding or settled view within the British body politic or even within the British government. Is this a unitary state? To what extent did the 1998 Northern Ireland Agreement enshrining international law dilute the UK as a unitary state? Is it, in Michael Keating's, a series of contested narratives? If so, which is the prevailing one at this point? We don't actually know. And what has happened without people really realizing it in this term, apart from some nerds like me and others, is that a particular form of constitutional narrative and constitutional objective policy, which I think the best description I've read is John Denham's, the former Labour cabinet minister. So it's not English nationalism. English nationalism wouldn't countenance the Barnett formula or stuff like that, but it's called Anglo-centric British nationalism. And that's a sort of, more polite and better way of saying know your place unionism. In other words, look, and it goes back to Philip's point, it's about the abandonment of restraint. The English have always had England has always had the electoral majority, but has never really used it. Now it's saying we want to redefine the state. If you want to stay in it, you stay in it in our terms. And that is why, as well as the technical and legal difficulties of a third way option, which I think are many, given the constitutional history of the UK, I think that I'm afraid the prospects for a genuine alternative to the binary choice that I know some people in the chat are actually really poor at the moment, because for as long as Anglo-centric British nationalism is in the ascendancy, for the rest of the UK, it's kind of a take it or leave it choice. In Scotland and Wales, it's, do you want this form of post-Brexit constitution? For Northern Ireland, is given your special circumstances, we'll just do something else for you, even without actually getting consent and widespread support for it from some of the communities. So I think it's by default, or not by default, but without a lot of people noticing, that one version of the contested narratives of the UK has suddenly become hugely ascendant in a way that estranges the others and actually pushes you towards binary choices rather than creative third solutions.
And we'll come on in a second to the second independence referendum and the challenges around that. But just on what you were saying there, Ciaran, the idea of a more muscular approach to the peripheries, if you like. And we can see that in Scotland. We read it in the papers regularly about the idea of muscular unionism. So spending money in devolved areas, central government at Westminster spending money in devolved areas, sticking a Union Jack on things. Recently, it's been deploying Kate and William to woo rebellious Scots. There have been weeks of stories about them being sent up, which I think is a dangerous approach in many ways. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on whether that would make a difference. I mean, in my view, is that that's not really what Scots are looking for from the Westminster government, and nor is it the reason that Scots are pulling away. It's more that we're looking at the Westminster government wanting them to do Westminster government things in ways that chime with the values of Scots, rather than wanting Westminster government to be busier in Scotland. We've got that covered. The Holyrood's doing that, for better or worse. But it seems like the analysis from down there is, well, we need to be more visible, more in their face, more showing what it is that we do and how relevant it is to their lives, and that's potentially a bit of a misreading of the reasons behind the drift towards support for independence. Any thoughts on that muscular unionism and its chances of success or failure from either of you?
You sort of more or less answered your own question in terms of how this is likely to appeal in Scotland. What I think people tend to forget is that in order to change the electoral geometry in Scotland, you have to appeal to folk who have considered or have voted for independence. In other words, you've got to persuade people who are currently certainly voting for the SNP. And if you look at the way the polls have hopped up and down over time, I mean, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a fair contention, I think, to suggest that probably top 50s, maybe even 60% or so of people in Scotland have at some time either voted in the 2014 referendum for independence or subsequently have made that emotional leap to think that independence may be the way forward for Scotland. This isn't like switching from Lib Dem to Labour or even from Tory to Labour. This is a big emotional commitment for people to take. You think, I've lived in Scotland for over 30 years. I lost the argument I'm obviously not from Scotland. I lost the argument in my household a long, long time ago. So I have two, sons in their 20s who grew up in Scotland. For them, in a way, when I came to Scotland, was just not the case. The idea of independence is normalised. The idea that Scotland might be independent, and of course, all the polls seem to indicate that a very high proportion of the younger end of the population are in support of independence. So how do you deal with that? You don't deal with that, as you say, by asserting the symbols of a state that a lot of these folk are finding objectionable. I happen to think that, and to be slightly technical about this for a minute, one of the faults of the early devolution settlement was not to give a decent programme budget, in the terminology, to the Scotland Office. That is a a budget for the Scotland Office to spend in Scotland aligned with devolved policies. Very common in federal states that the federal entity has the power to spend. For Australia, on education across the different parts of Australia, it's quite common. So that as a principle, I think is perfectly understandable. I think would have been a good thing to have in the devolution settlement. But to do it late in the day and to do it over the heads of the democratically elected devolved government in Scotland, I think appeals to far too narrow a band of opinion in Scotland. And I just a final word on this. I'd throw another R word into the mix, which is what I spoke about a lot when I was in government, working in the government. It's the reasonableness agenda. The UK demonstrating its interactions with the devolved government that it is reasonable. It's holding that moral ground, high ground. And I think there is a tension there still in the policy of the UK government. I don't think it's all swung into that muscular space. I think there are those who recognise that the way that you demonstrate to the people of Scotland that you're on side is to bring the Scottish government, the Welsh government, the Northern Executive into the tent and to make them part of the decision taking for the whole country. So there is a way forward on this. I'm not a great fan of the muscular route personally.
And Ciaran, just before we move on to audience questions, I'd like to just talk a bit about the second referendum. So if we go back to 2014, you were managing a large part of the London end of setting it up. I wonder what your memories are from that and what lessons you would be drawing from it as we consider a rerun.
Well, the politics are very, very different because, for better or worse, the historical fact is that within 72 hours, 24 maybe, I can't remember, of the declaration of the results, Prime Minister Cameron had conceded the principle of a referendum, to the surprise of many, and it was a matter of making it work. I mean, I think that there are. I mean, firstly, I do think that whilst it's understandable in terms of the capacity of governments and so forth, I think history will take a view, whatever happens, that not to put in some clear. There's a lot of talk about. There's a lot of uncertainty about what a yes vote would mean, but there wasn't much clarity about what a no vote would mean. Beyond the status quo, there was the late vow and the Smith Commission and so forth. But actually, the terms of staying in the Union. There's always been this, there's a very interesting sort of set of opinions within the Conservative Party over many decades that have long recognised Scotland's right to leave the United Kingdom, but has long resented Scotland's perceived right to dictate its terms within it, and so forth. I do think that, first of all, I mean, there is a decision which I think can only fall to the British Cabinet about the principle, and if they don't concede that, then there is no discussion to be had. I would expect the SNP just to continue, and the Scottish Government to continue, and the wider independence movement to continue largely entirely constitutional politics in that eventuality. If they do concede the principle, I'm not sure there's a great deal wrong with the 2014 procedures. I mean, many people might say I would say that, wouldn't I? But genuinely, things around, whilst I deeply understand it as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, didn't have a vote in the 1998 referendum because I lived in London for 18 months. It's just very practical. Having been the director working to Philip in charge of the electoral system, it's fiendishly complicated and hugely divisive to do anything else. I do think that it's too late now, in my view, although not in the views of others. It's too late now to do it in advance of a potential second referendum. But if there is one, you do have to plan for a no vote and what it means for staying in the United Kingdom. In other words, is there going to be a time limit? Are there going to be thresholds and so forth? I mean, I find, I'll do a plug, I've just published a blog for the Constitution Society at 12:29. It was uploaded for this. I find the UK government's silence on the election result quite interesting, because if you take, for example, one of the measures, the single party majority for the SNP, the UK government aren't crowing about the fact that the SNP fell one short, because they don't want to say, well, if in 2026 you get 65, then we'll concede one. There was no threshold for them to meet. It's all ethereal, and we have to take judgments. I do think that that's pretty strange by international standards. So, it would have been better at the end of 2014 with a defeated nationalist movement to, set out some rules, or at least offer to talk about them. I think as a precondition of a second one, you'd need to have some, procedures for this, because I've been accused of advocating a referendum anytime the SNP come close to majority. That's not my position. My position is you cannot say that the UK is genuinely different from most countries in that it allows its constituent, or at least in principle allows its constituent parts to have self-determination, and then provide no basis or no pathway to that. That's just a completely paradoxical and unsustainable position.
So on your criteria, did the result in May mean that there should be should Westminster allow a second referendum to take place within this Parliament?
I mean, precisely because it's Westminster's own fault that it didn't set out any alternatives, then yes. I mean, that's the luxury of the academic. People have to take real life political judgments, but then the question is, if not this, what? I mean, I do think that if you look it is worth rewinding or uploading the Andrew Marr, Michael Gove interview. And by the way, I saw the question, when I was referring to MPs sitting for Scottish constituencies, not Scottish born MPs, but the Andrew Marr, Michael Gove interview is really interesting. Question 1, does Scotland have the right to leave the United Kingdom? Answer, yes. What is the path to leaving the United Kingdom for Scotland? Through a lawful referendum. What is the path to a lawful referendum? That was not the time. Well, hang on. Answer 3 doesn't quite cut it, does it?
Yeah. And Philip, would you agree that the result in May really should allow the SNP to hold a referendum within this Parliament?
I think the question is I sort of rode back slightly. I think the question of Scotland's right to self-determination is established. That's what we did in 2014. The question is not whether that right is there. It's when it should be exercised. I think the SNP's own admission now is not the time because of COVID recovery and all of that. You look at opinion polls, people saying, well, shouldn't be top priority. Trouble is, of course, COVID recovery is how long's a piece of string. When does it become the right time? I sort of suspect we'll know, and this is, Ciaran, of course, is absolutely logically, absolutely right. There ought to be a pathway that people understand. We're not going to get that. This will be a matter of politics. In my view of this, if I maybe just share that my thought on this is that I very much doubt that this UK government, this Parliament, will accede to a referendum. I think that risk is just way too high for the current Prime Minister. But I think the circumstances that might shift the dial would actually be the next Westminster parliamentary election. I suspect that'll come early. The last vestige of the reform programme, that constitutional reform programme that Ciaran and I worked on when we were working for Mr Clegg, or Sir Nick as we should call him now, Fixed Term Parliament Act, is going to get dumped very shortly. That'll allow the UK government to bring forward that election. They'll do that, I suspect, into late 23 in order to catch the tail end of the post-COVID economic recovery bounce. And then it's not difficult to envisage a scenario there that you've got another Tory government, probably a reduced majority, probably around 40% of the popular vote. The SNP more or less cleaning up again in Scotland, with a higher proportion of the popular, perhaps up to and over 50%. In those circumstances, it seems to me it becomes very, very difficult for a UK government to say, no, you've not got a mandate for a referendum. So that's, I think, the way the politics will work. Logic says, follow the, sort of Clarity Act type thing, but I think we're past the point when that can be made to work, because this is a question now. It's not a theoretical question for the future.
That's absolutely fascinating. Right, I'm going to move on to questions. We could talk about that for a long time, actually, but got to let people in. I'll start with Graham Downey. Graham, are you with us still?
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah, I just wondered to what extent do you need English consent? There's not been much of a clamour in England for any constitutional change, but to what extent do you require English consent for constitutional change, given they're the largest country in the current union? And how do you go about trying to secure that enthusiasm for change, never mind kind of approval for it, or do you not need it at all?
I have a go at England. One of the fascinating things about this whole debate, I mean, England is in many ways is the neglected part of this story. I think absolutely fascinating. You look at English attitudes. There was Comrade's poll in the Telegraph the other day confirming what YouGov and other polls have suggested. That the majority attitude in England towards Scottish independence and indeed to unification on the island of Ireland could be caricatured as indifference. The number who are opposed to Scottish independence in the 30-odd%, I think, if I remember rightly. So what's going on in England, I think, is a much neglected part of this debate. And I think, to answer your question, if we ever did get into the space of what I would think of as thoroughgoing constitutional reform, the remaking of the British state, which would include substantial cohate proper devolution within England, a reform of the second chamber, and all of that, I personally think, to be consolidated, would need to be put to some sort of referendum. I think that would only be right. Whether England gets to decide on Scotland leaving, no, that didn't happen last time and it won't happen again. That's for the Scots. So if you pushed into the binary space of status quo or independence, there's not a lot of looking for English consent to that. But if you're in that more middle space of an alternative road forward, then that has to involve England and English opinion absolutely to the fullest extent.
Okay, well, I'll just move on to the next question just so we can get through a few. John McTernan. Are you with us, John?
Yes, sorry, just unmuting. I would have a few observations on what it was like to be in either end of the situation when Labour were in government north and south of the border. But my actual question was, how much is this all complicated by the fact that we now have two governments, two nationalist governments, a British nationalist and a Scottish nationalist government, who are both running government as a permanent campaign, and that, in many ways, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson have just taken up the Sturgeon salmon playbook, magnifying grievances, politicizing previously neutral public institutions, etc., etc. I mean, how can a logical constitutional conversation, or even an illogical one, occur in a situation where both of the major governments involved are running a permanent campaign?
Ciaran, do you want to take that one?
It's a really powerful point, and I think, given that we are in some sort of lull in the constitutional standoff for a year or however long it is before the Scottish government decide to move legislatively on a referendum, I think John's right that there is in effect a campaign going on. I think it further diminishes the chances of creative thinking. I think also, frankly, the big decisions here are for the UK government, because as said earlier, it is not the objective of the SNP government in Holyrood to make the union work. So and it will be campaigning in effect from its seat in government to make a more convincing case for independence than proved the case in 2014. I think for the UK government, there is a big decision on what it is campaigning for. And this comes back to the previous question and a lot of the discussion about the nature of the United Kingdom we want to live in. So it comes back to, at the minute they're kind of running an attempt at Philip's reasonableness and respect agenda and muscular unionism, or know your place unionism, at the same time. On COVID recovery, it's Team UK. On the Internal Market Act, it's actually much more aggressive than realised. Like Philip, I don't have a problem in principle with spending in devolved areas, but the lowering of trading standards and so forth in the internal market and the deliberate weakening of devolved authority, and that is a big power play, which I think is designed to weaken the devolved institutions that they see as irritating. Now, this brings me to a point that I think the UK government will ride both horses for a while. It will be very respectful of devolved sensibilities, particularly in Scotland. but in other parts it'll be very aggressive. But often this is seen as a, as a tactical question. What is the best strategy for shoring up the union? Is it respectful reasonableness or is it muscular unionism? I actually think it's more powerful. It goes to the point about England's consent and so forth. I agree with Philip and everybody else. I assume that, Scotland has the right to self-determination, but anything beyond that has to have a modicum or more than a modicum of UK-wide consent. So this question on muscular unionism versus sort of reasonableness, respectful unionism is also about what sort of United Kingdom do we want to live in. I mean, both versions are perfectly valid, but a very much unitary state which downplays the historic national differences, where Holyrood certainly doesn't get any stronger but weakens over time because the Internal Market Act strategy is a success, where and it may be a long shot, but it might work. The future is not preordained, and the the union has been through arguably worse and survived it. So the question I've got is, what does the UK government want to achieve? Does it want to shore up a union that's really quite sort of different, messy, multinational, and so forth? Because then it should campaign for that. Or does it actually want to say, you know what, we let this genie out of the bottle. We nearly lost the union. Let's ultimately try over time to, let this stuff atrophy. I mean, we can't really get rid of it, but let's minimize differences within the UK. Let's govern as one nation. The clunky briefing about the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge was one thing. The instruction to diplomats to stop talking about the four nations was actually quite significant in that respect. Let's actually start talking about Britain again. Let's be British nationalists about it, because British nationalism might not just be more. So are you campaigning for that sort of unitary state British nationalism, or are you campaigning to save the union on the basis of that sort of respectful reasonableness, messy multinational settlement? The answer is we don't know yet, and so I think that's another reason why it complicates matters in the way that John's suggesting.
Okay, Andrew Wilson. Andrew.
Thanks, Chris. I was just going to ask about the idea of a better devolution deal and how can that cope with the Brexit reality which got us back into this debate in the first place. So I suppose the question is it possible to construct a situation where Scotland's more in the EU than at present, and indeed than other parts of the UK?
Let me pick that one up. Thanks for the question, Andrew. And it's a really tough question. Of course, there are limits to what Scotland can do outside of the EU. There are some programs that Scotland could maybe be part of that the rest of the UK was not, but the legal reality, you're out, you're a third country, and that is what is determinative of your status. And the Scottish government obviously worked quite hard in 2016, 2017 as a sort of prospectus of somehow could Scotland stay in the single market even if the rest of the UK came out. We've seen the history of that through the Northern Ireland Protocol, seeking to do that on the GB mainland. It essentially means you're going to have a land border of some description. It is very, very tough territory. I think it all comes back to the sort of departure point that Brexit has proved to be in terms of forcing the choice on where the future should lie. There's no getting around that. And of course, in 2014, one of the big stances of the No campaign was that the way that Scotland could guarantee its place in the EU was to vote no. And clearly that is one of the big conditions that has changed through Brexit. So Brexit, I think, on the one hand, it complicates the prospectus for independence because of that whole border question. Scotland would essentially have to choose whether to remain part of the internal UK market or become part of the single market. You can't be in both in the way long term, and the way that has been attempted in Northern Ireland is not, I think, a stable position for an independent Scotland. But on the other hand, of course, it has driven opinion in Scotland, as we've discussed earlier on, of people thinking, well, this is not the sort of United Kingdom we want to be in. So it seems to me the working out for people in Scotland the way forward post-Brexit becomes the fundamental issue. in determining Scotland's choice in the future. I don't think there are palliatives around that which have sort of Scotland half in, half out the EU, because legally that just doesn't work.
Ciaran, do you want to say anything about that? I've got one more question after this, and then we'll wrap it up. No, well, go to Martin McCluskey for the last question. I think Martin's been doing some close reading. I can read in his message. Are you there, Martin?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Chris. It's just a quick one. In Suzanne Haywood's book on Jeremy Haywood's life, there's obviously both of you are mentioned extensively, but there was one little bit that caught my eye, which was Jeremy Haywood, Helen McNamara, and Philip would meet to discuss very privately what would happen if there was a yes vote in a referendum, even though the Prime Minister at the time had forbidden you from doing that. I'm just wondering how Whitehall should approach that kind of preparation if there's another referendum, and given the Brexit experience, perhaps is there an argument for pre-negotiation of what it would look like if Scotland were to leave?
I think it's only fair to let Ciaran come in first on this one while Philip organises his thoughts.
Yeah, I wasn't there. I think it's very hard to put the British Prime Minister in a position where he or she has to negotiate the terms of the breakup on behalf of everybody in the United Kingdom, excluding the people of Scotland for whom he or she is still responsible. So that's the big barrier to it. More positively, but also I think a challenge for those in favour of independence, is that I think we can overdo how much, and that's actually a challenge for unionists as well. We can overdo how much this would yield, how much knowledge and information this would actually yield. The future is not preordained. Nobody predicted that Brexit would take effect in the middle of the worst global pandemic for a century. And one of the reasons why I'm very cautious about a second referendum, a confirmatory referendum, is that again the British Prime Minister would have to be negotiating in the hope that would persuade Scotland to say no by being brutal, and would be negotiating differently from if he or she was in the position where the decision was settled and irreversible. But another reason is more practical. Independence negotiations will tell you the share of assets and debt. It will tell you a bit about trading arrangements, but then of course if Scotland applies to join the EU, those could change, as Philip's just said. It won't tell you anything about Scotland's application to join the EU. It won't tell you anything about Scotland's application to join NATO. It won't tell you anything about the electoral choices that Scottish voters might make after independence. I mean, theoretically, they could go for a radical free market Conservative party. It seems highly unlikely at the minute, but there's nothing, So I think we can overdo, I find, frankly, one of the most frustrating things in this debate is, but I understand the politics of why it's unionist demands for give us facts about the future, which is an oxymoron if ever I've heard one, and then the other paradox of 2014 was nationalism, saying that the biggest constitutional upheaval for 3 centuries wouldn't involve very much change. I mean, both of those positions are ridiculous, and I think we need a more sort of rational debate in the future.
Philip, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, and that's Suzanne's little anecdote was meant to be for my memoirs. So I sort of slightly let the cat out of the bag. I think I absolutely agree what Ciaran says. This is politically contested space. The notion that you can have, some sort of clean vision of a future, which is essentially a negotiated future, is for the birds. I think you could have something, and I think this may be worth thinking about, that was at least posed the question, some disinterested third party, as it were, setting out the sorts of issues that would need to be resolved if Scotland were to become independent. I think there's precedence for that in the way that other debates have been conducted elsewhere in the world. I'm not a fan of pre-negotiation. I don't think, as Ciaran said, I don't think that can work. But I think one of the things that, I do remember in those discussions sitting down, talking about this, just the key question for the government of a remainder UK in these circumstances would be, what sort of relationship would they want with their closest, most important neighbour, an independent Scotland? And that's got lost to sight. And I think it's got obscured a little bit through the Brexit debate as well, the position the EU's taken. Was it right? Was it wrong? But let's never forget, you can't, no more than the UK can tear itself away from the European continent, no more can Scotland take itself away from these islands, we will continue to be living on these islands collectively forever. And so the big question in those circumstances, particularly for the government of the remainder UK, would be, what sort of relationship do we want to build with this newly independent country? And one would hope that that spirit, in a positive way, would infuse those negotiations come the day. But as Ciaran says, the future would be a negotiated one. Very, very difficult to delineate it in detail before you get there.
Well, that seems good. A good point to end with an open question and the unknowability of the future. So I'd just like to thank both Ciaran and Philip for today. I thought it was utterly engrossing, and you've given me so much to think about and put so many new spins on things that I think I'll probably get columns on this till the end of the year, both of you. I also hope that you'll both come back at some point, because clearly there's an awful lot more to talk about, and as events unfold there'll be more to say, and certainly getting the benefit of your joint wisdom is hugely useful. So thank you to you, and thank you to everyone for turning up and for your questions. And if you keep an eye on your inboxes, we will have more events from Reform Scotland soon, and we hope you'll enjoy them, and they'll be just as good as this one was. So thank you very much again, and we'll see you all soon.